We recently asked a couple hundred of you emerging biotech leaders about your go-to sources of information when you face tough professional challenges. Your top response wasn't webinars, it wasn't scientific journals, it wasn't trade shows, it wasn't even consultants. Far and away, you said you most often turn to your peers for trusted insight. Enabling a community of peers is what the Business of Biotech podcast is all about. It's also what our new Business of Biotech newsletter is all about. Peer-driven content, no strings attached, delivered to your inbox once a month. Go to bioprocessonline.com/BOB to subscribe. The Business of Biotech is produced by Bioprocess Online, part of the Life Science Connect community, with support from Cytiva. Cytiva also demonstrates its commitment to the leaders of new and emerging biopharma at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. Check that out. Welcome back to the Business of Biotech, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Matt Pillar, and if you're a regular listener, you might recall an episode that we did a few months ago called Anatomy of a VC Deal with 4Bio's Dima Kuzmin and Ray Therapeutics' Paul Bresky. I thought it would be a cool idea at the time to invite a funder and a fundee, so to speak, onto the show to walk through and break down their relationship. And I guess that was a pretty good hunch because it's turned out to be one of our most popular episodes ever. So I decided we'd do it again, this time with an old friend of the show, Vedanta Biosciences CEO, Dr. Bernat Olle, along with one of his most recent backers, K2 Health Ventures founding managing director and CEO, Parag Shah. Parag and Bernat, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Matt, and good to see you, Parag.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Great to be here with you, Bernat.
I'm excited to have you both. And Bernat, I want to start with you because, as I mentioned, you're an old friend of the show. I had you on the show first back on episode, I think it was like 23 of the podcast, which is way back in November 2020. A lot's changed. You still look terrific. You don't look like you've aged a bit in the last 3 years.
I've used the lighting between.
It's good lighting. But I want to start with you, and I would just hope that you could give us a quick update. I know it's going to be tough because it's been 2.5 years, but give us a quick overview of what progress has happened at Vedanta in the time that's elapsed since we last talked.
Yeah. So you and I talked November 2020. At that time, we had just hired our Chief Medical Officer, Jeff, one of the best decisions I've ever made.
Oh, good job, Jeff.
Yeah. The biotech public markets were flying high, very high. There was scores of companies going public every week. We had just received a contract from BARDA, the agency of the US government, around our lead program. We had finished phase 1 data showing that drug was safe and well tolerated. And we now wanted to bring it into a study in patients that have a type of hospital-acquired infection called Clostridium difficile, or C. difficile for short.
Mm-hmm.
So that contract was important for us because it brought a lot of non-dilutive capital into the company. And at the time, basically, what we knew about our lead program was that the drug was safe and that the dose seemed to matter. And I say seemed to matter because we could see that the more you gave, the more colonization of the bacteria. We make drugs that are based on bacteria. So the more dose we gave, the more colonization we could see in the intestines of patients. What we did not know at the time, which we've spent our time and funding since to get to know, is one, whether you be efficacious in patients, and two, what is the threshold of dosing and colonization that you needed to see efficacy. And so the key development from a drug development point of view, the key development since we last spoke is that we did conduct a first phase 2 study, a randomized phase 2 study in patients with this infectious disease. We saw that the high dose of our drug worked really well. We tried 2 doses, a low dose and a high dose. The high dose worked very well, the low dose didn't. And it gave results that were clinically, we think, very relevant compared to the drugs that exist today. So on the basis of that, we needed to go back to the well and fundraise more, which I guess we'll talk about today, to be able to run a phase 3 study, which we hope could be a pivotal study that leads to a first approval of this drug modality. And so we've been working on all the preparation work to first build a facility to be able to manufacture our drug, and then qualify, validate it, and we're now in the middle of the GMP runs to produce the drug that will go into the phase 3 study, which we plan to start later this year. And in the meantime, we have a second program that is for inflammatory bowel diseases. Specifically, we're looking at a study in colitis where there's a phase 2 study that's starting imminently.
Well, that's exciting progress.
Busy.
Yeah, you certainly have been busy. It's exciting progress. You mentioned building manufacturing facility. Is that work that's taken place since we last spoke, just in the recent couple of years? Yeah.
So when we last spoke, I told you that the manufacturing of our drugs was complex. Maybe for a little bit of context, our drugs are made of defined consortia of bacteria. So each drug has multiple species of bacteria that make up the active ingredients. Our lead program, for example, has 8 different active ingredients. Those bacteria are anaerobes, so you cannot expose them to oxygen when you manufacture them. There's many of them. Some of them form spores. The number of things that make the manufacturing complex, which basically cornered us into having to build this manufacturing capabilities in-house.
Yeah.
When we last spoke, we had done manufacturing for phase 1 and phase 2 studies, which is a certain degree of buttoning up. But for phase 3 studies, and in particular because we want to use the same facility for a potential commercial launch if the drug gets approved, then you have to meet a different standard with the agencies. So we built that facility in our Cambridge site, and we spent some time getting it up and running, doing engineering runs, doing all the validation, training the personnel, and now we're in actual campaigning, making drug for phase 3 studies, which is exciting.
Yeah, super exciting. And you mentioned the first question I asked you were talking about like what the times looked like just 2.5 years ago. And you mentioned the capital markets were flying high at the time. Not so much anymore, but if I looked at it in a vacuum, if I was dropped onto the earth from Mars and I had no idea what was going on in biopharma capital markets right now, and I looked at what Vedanta did in the springtime, raising $106.5 million. I think, well, that's pretty impressive, particularly in light of these sort of stingy market conditions, and market conditions that haven't been like super hot on microbiome therapies. In fact, quite a few folks in your space have kind of suffered recently. So I'm just curious about your strategy going into that fundraising effort, swimming against that tide and coming out on top.
Yeah. I like your analogy of coming from Mars. Everything looks beautiful and pretty on a press release. And, the reality of running a startup is like everything is hard in this environment, harder. Our goal with the financing was to get sufficient funds to be able to do essentially 2 things: to run the phase 3 study of our lead program in infectious disease, and to run the phase 2 study of our next program in inflammatory bowel disease. And for that, we needed a little bit over $100 million. We knew that insiders alone could not cover all of that, so we need to bring a meaningful amount of capital from new investors, and getting that was the number 1 priority. Mm-hmm. You can only optimize for so many things in those processes, right? So we needed to find, a syndicate and demand to cover that. And given the market conditions that you mentioned and I mentioned, the strategy was to broaden the pool, find out who was active, meaning investors, and really focus on the substance. That's the short version of it. The more elaborate version is, as you know, investors active in private deals, well, all types of deals, have shrunk significantly. There's whole groups like crossovers that have been just sitting out of the market, mostly absent from private rounds. Some focused on buying cheap, dislocated public stocks instead. Some's just sitting on the sidelines. So we had to do a bit of work to try to piece out who were the investors active in this market.
Yeah.
Talking to network or IR firm, banks can be helpful with that too. And take a broad look at growing our potential syndicate. So looking at both strategics and financial investors, looking both in the US, but also ex-US. In the ultimate financing, we ended up having investors from Europe, from Asia. And you're right that microbiome is not favored. I'd say in this market, nothing is really favored.
No, you're right. And I didn't mean to, I certainly didn't mean to,
No, but you're right. I mean, our field has seen, I know you're saying that our field has seen its fair share of hype in the past. At times it's been accused of that too, rightfully, I would say. It had negative news from public companies in 21 and 22, both negative clinical reads and companies delisting, general contraction of the field. A good thing that we had going for us was that we had our own clinical data, phase 2 data, with clear, unambiguous efficacy. So we could be judged on the basis and merits of the data that we generated, rather than data from others. And we focused on the substance and the fact that we had meaningfully de-risked this asset in the clinic. We focused on explaining what we thought was a realistic path to get it approved, and the case for why we think it could be commercially relevant. And I think in this environment, that is one of the key things that investors are looking for, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the investors who obviously must have been listening to that first episode that we recorded way back when, heard those early clinical results and thought, boy, I better get on board, was Parag Shah from K2 Health Ventures. I'm going to go ahead and assume that he listened to that episode and that it influenced his decision to get behind.
Absolutely.
Parag, you guys were a new contributor to the recent round. And I want to get both your perspectives on this, sort of the coming together of K2 Health Ventures and Vedanta. But I'll start with you, Parag, since you've been waiting patiently to field a question. Tell us about the coming together. What circumstances led you to Bernat and the company?
Yeah, it was in this business, you meet people in many different ways. A lot of traditional ways that you might meet folks, from, board introductions to conferences to seeing one of their presentations to reading about their data. And we did know about Vedanta because we have, as K2, we had looked at the microbiome space. We had looked at a number of different players. We've looked at some who no longer exist in this space as well. But my particular meeting with Bernat was fairly unique, and it comes sometimes from, when you do good things, other good things happen. And in this particular case, this was through the Timmerman Traverse. It was the presidential range hike this past September 2022. Luke Timmerman puts together a set of hikes that he's now done kind of all over the world. This one was on our coast in the White Mountains, and it's scaling 7 peaks named after 7 different presidents across about 2.5 days. And you do it with a bunch of biotech executives, other investors. But the primary purpose is obviously, you're doing the hike, so it's there, but it's raising capital for Life Sciences Cares, which is a anti-poverty organization. So there's this whole profit and purpose piece that goes along with it that I think goes throughout both our ethos as K2. I know Bernat has talked about this in his path, what probably brought him here from Catalonia at some point to, use all his skill sets in the best way he possibly could and make a difference. I think that's part of what initially might have connected us unknowingly, but I would say the real reason is I was a laggard in the hike. I'm in the back of the pack, and Bernat was one of the unofficial guides of the hike. So he had to stay in the back to make sure everybody actually got up the mountain. So it was a natural forcing function to have our long conversation as you go up for 8-10 hours over multiple peaks in a day. And at some point you have to stop talking, because all I could focus on was just put the next foot in front of the other. I have to make it to the lodge tonight. There's no way down. So, but through that, got to really know Bernat in a much different way in a beautiful setting. And we got to have a longer conversation, let's say, that doesn't just become your 15-minute soundbite of trying to impress each other, but, get to kind of, where did you come from? How did you start? Why are you doing this? All of that. So, that led me to understand a few different things about what is important to us in someone who's leading something like this, because as Bernat said, it's a very, very, very hard task in doing something novel, new, and building out something that is different, even within a defined area of microbiome. It's not so defined. You're making up some of that as you go along in terms of what really works. So, anyway, through that, I will say the key differentiating point for me always, and it's played out well for me, is this idea of persistence, right? And, there's the presidential range is a good analogy for this. There was a former president speech that dealt with persistence and talks about persistence forges results, right? And the key piece there is like, there are plenty of geniuses and unrequited geniuses, almost a proverb. There's plenty of educated derelicts, but persistence is usually what gets you over the hump. And I think you can recognize that in different people. And this fundraising process, the building that manufacturing facility that we toured, is a labor of love, right? It's a labor. Yeah. You make a lot of mistakes along the way, but you have to keep going. And we saw that in what Bernat and his team, Dan Kudo on the manufacturing side, he mentioned Jeff Silber, what they had been able to put together there. So, that attracted us. It's something that has helped me in my, time in developing K2 as well, and building that up from the ground up. Persistence is a big part of it. Mm-hmm. You mix that in with some amount of smarts and a little bit of humor along the way, and I think you can go a long distance.
Yeah, I know Dr. Olle has both of those, smarts and humor. And I want to unpack some of that, but real quick, I'm going to go ahead and publicly put Luke Timmerman on blast. I'd like him to come join me as a guest on the Business of Biotech. So I'm putting that out there right now, Luke. If you're listening, I want to learn more. So several of my guests over the years have been participants in Timmerman Traverse adventures and expeditions. It's an amazing cause that I want to hear more about. So Luke, come on the podcast. But I want to. What was that, Bernat?
We will nudge him.
Yes, yeah. Give him a nudge. We got to get him on. But this setting, this initial setting for the initial meeting, I don't want to second guess this commitment, but it's easy to make commitments in these thrilling, maybe sometimes irrational commitments in these thrilling and beautiful environs. And Parag, you said you were bringing up the rear, and Bernat was kind of nudging you along. Maybe there was a little bit of deference to Bernat. I don't know, Bernat, I don't want to accuse you of threatening anyone, but there may have been a little bit of like, you're not going to make it off this mountain if you don't get behind my company. So putting that in.
A part that since you were fishing here, a part that Parag omitted, which was interesting, made an impression, is when we got to the hut at the Lake of the Clouds, which is the hut right on the Mount Washington, is the highest hut in the White Mountains. Yeah. Everybody just went right in to get like some hot drink or whatever. And I have this weird thing where whenever I'm out in the mountains and I'm like sweaty and tired, I like to find a river or a lake and just get in there, no matter how cold it is. And it's weird. Nobody else wants to do this. So as soon as I get to the hut, I pick up my stuff, I head to the lake, and guess who's there already in the lake? Parag.
Parag's in the lake.
I was like, okay, I need to find out more about this guy. This is interesting.
that was definitely a moment where it's the two of us are in this ice cold lake on that day. And then the second day you pulled me into some other ice cold where we were soaking our aching legs just to get the swelling down a little bit. And so multiple good points there with water.
Yeah. Also, there are no showers in the huts. So it's either the lake or Houston for a few days. That's another
Yeah. You get to know each other pretty well in any event, whether you're smelling each other or getting in the lake together.
Yeah.
That inspirational setting aside, Parag, what was it about Vedanta that really aligned? Like, when did it come together for you when you realized there was something about this company that really aligned with your strategy? And I don't want to dig too deep, so I've got some questions for you about your portfolio strategy because it's incredibly diverse. I dare I say that, to the outsider looking in, you might look at the K2 Health Ventures portfolio and be like, I mean, their strategy is quite blankly diversity because they have an incredibly diverse portfolio. But specific to Vedanta, what was it about the company and its efforts that you thought like this is going to be a good match or a good fit for our portfolio development?
Yeah. So, and, we can, as you said, we can get into later our portfolio strategy. I'll focus maybe on the first part of that question now. Yeah. We had looked at the microbiome space. We looked at other folks. We tend to go fairly deep in a particular area. And as we did that, we lay out the landscape of who are the different players in that space. So obviously Vedanta was one of them. And then what some of the pros and cons differentiation pieces are there for each one. And it wasn't necessarily on the hike that we got into all the details, but, suffice it to say that there was enough interesting information with respect to the platform, right? One of our fundamental thesis is, can this platform spawn multiple shots on goal? Does it have the capacity to really go, yes, you have your lead program. What's after that? If we can give more capital towards that, can we see this in the long term, continuing to put capital in here to get past and do multiple good things over time? And what Bernat and the team had built was exactly that, right? This ability to put together a variety of different defined bacterial consortium, not an easy problem, in a way that goes in a pill, okay, unique for microbiome, the delivery modality, the cost, the ease of administration, all of these pieces start to play out as like, oh, wow, you could really affect a very broad population if this works. And that's why you do the clinical trials. And, they were deep into that part, and our capital could play out on both sides. We participated significantly in the, full raise. We also do both debt and equity capital, Matt. So we provide equity, but we also provide less dilutive capital on the debt side to help companies extend cash runways, as well as do it in a less dilutive way for themselves, their existing shareholders, et cetera. So we were able to provide a multi-pronged financing, and Vedanta was interested in that or open to it, had done some of that before, understood it. And, the stars aligned down the road. The beginnings of it was at the Timmerman Traverse, but conversations obviously continued for multiple months after.
Yeah. Before we get into the details of some of those conversations, I want to flip that question sort of on its other side and pose it to you, Bernat. I've had many conversations with folks like Alan Shaw, who's a frequent guest on the podcast, and he's pretty, he's sort of a biopharma finance guru, and he's told me that not all money is good money, even in restricted capital markets, even when money's super hard to come by. Not all money is good money. Why was K2HV good money for Vedanta?
So, when you're past all the work of figuring out if it's worth spending time with an investor in terms of, what role they take in the financing, what's the right stage for them, what's the sweet spot, is the ticket size something that makes sense for your round, let's move the needle, which is more like the mechanical part of figuring out who you should focus the efforts on. I think you have to go with proxies to figure out if it's going to be a good cultural fit. It's a little bit like being in interviews, either as an interviewer or as a candidate. You're trying to piece together from an interview whether, there's going to be a good relationship.
Yeah.
And, some of the things that I look for when I talk to people that maybe we consider as teammates are, do they really know the company very well in the space cold? Do they know what they're getting into?
Mm-hmm.
And do the questions that they ask show that they understand the risks that they would be getting into, and they're comfortable with that.
Yeah.
I think that the same is a good thing to look for in potential investors. Do they really understand the field and the company well? And do the questions that they ask show that they understand and they have gotten comfortable with the risks that they're assuming with that investment?
Mm-hmm.
So I look for this. People understand their story well, ask good questions, and particularly underscore can give good, candid feedback. Candid, actionable, it's rare. It's very rare. It's actually harder to get high quality feedback than it is to get dollars. And I don't think this is an exaggeration. So I felt like the K2 team, Parag and Austin, who work with us, understand the field very well. They run a thorough process, but efficient, to diligence the company. They focused on some of the important risks that I would have diligenced if I was on their side, and also throughout gave good, candid feedback on their thoughts. So these are some of the things that I saw, but also that I look for in other investors that we interact with.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're now that you're back at sea level and your heads are on straight, you're not starving for oxygen. You start looking at the hard, the sort of the hard facets of the. I don't mean hard like difficult. I mean hard like hard-edged facets of this relationship that's to come.
Yeah, and Matt, it takes, sorry to, just to add on to Bernat's point there, it's, it takes two to tango. And we find in companies that we work with, and Bernat mentioned my colleague Austin, who I've worked with him for 16, 17 years. My co-founder, Anup Arora, who, we've now worked together for 10 years. And our process of getting deep is something we say that, the companies that like that are going to be a natural selection for companies that we want to work with, and have at least the patience to bear with us as we get a little deeper into each piece of that. And hopefully it makes us both a little bit better, and it helps us be a better long-term partner for the company, so that when the inevitable ups and downs happen and things don't necessarily go according to plan, you're not just going off of one graphic and say, hey, see, you told me you were going to get this thing done by this date. But in reality, when you dig into it, you're like, all right, well, there's so many factors that go into picking this one point in time that this is when I'm going to get the data. And the variability. You understand how different it can be, and you work within that, and you don't freak out when things don't happen according to the timeline. In fact, you try and support the company or bring your own thoughts to bear and participate in the conversation in that process. So that helps us be better investors. Not, I would say 2/3 or 3/4 of companies like that. Not all management teams like that. And there's a natural selection point where you're like, okay, we're not the right buyer and seller in this, tango. But, in the case of Bernat and his team, they were very patient with us, and they spent all the time that we needed. And we really appreciated that. And it led us to, really want to double down.
Yeah, one of my questions, obviously sort of surface level, you could take as deep as you want, is what each partner is looking for. And Dr. Olle, you began to answer that already. Like you were looking for a partner that would give you quality feedback. And, maybe sometimes that quality feedback isn't always like, just some pleasantry feedback. It can be pushback even at times, I'm assuming. Can you, can either of you share some examples of like what kind of quality feedback, what it looks like what it was in the case of the K2HV Vedanta relationship? Like, I don't know, an example.
I try to do that in a way that I don't get into too much confidential information, but I think that
sure,
the most useful discussion is when the company kind of lays out, look, this is what we think are the key risks of the investment that you're considering, and these are the things that we put in place to mitigate that. And so, in our case, in our field, even being able to make the product, manufacture it, is a big risk, and there's been failures there.
Yeah.
And so you need to explain, this is why it's a problem, and these are the things that we've done, so that hopefully we mitigated. And in our field, in the past, recruiting for patients has been challenging. So we had to, explain, this is the challenges that we've had. But for the phase 3, this is how we're planning to be able to recruit better. And these are all the places where we want to go. And this is how we plan to design the study so they can recruit well. And so basically go category by category, acknowledge the risk that we think is important, and then give the opportunity to the partner to then kind of either ask us directly questions or go to KOLs and ask them the same question to get a different view from them. I think if you can focus a lot of the time on what everybody things are those key risks, that's where you get the best spend time, either because the party decides those risks are not right for them, or because they understand it and they buy on your approach to discharge them, and then you can move forward with an investment.
Yeah.
And I would add that, one of the things that is useful in this process, and this would be a tip to any other entrepreneur as well who's fundraising, is that I think one thing that Bernat and team did really well is that they compiled a document of questions from all their different due diligence meetings, like people who came up with different things, risks, worries, angles. And some people might think, oh, well, I don't want to share this because maybe that will make this investor think of things they never even thought of and take them down a rabbit hole. But I think what it does is it shows to investors that you've really thought through everything and you're not trying to hide anything, right? You're saying, hey, here's what it is. Here's how we've thought about it. It's never 100% certain one way or the other, but here's what all the mitigants are. And you can see different people, and it becomes a more collaborative process. And ultimately that usually works out better. So I think that feedback loop that happens when I think we added some questions to that list, others added questions to that list, and you get a more robust kind of understanding of the company over the long term. So,
yeah,
that's a good point. The Q&A document. So this is the question, as Parag said. Parag said a document with all the questions we received from investors and our answers. We started this for selfish reasons because, we would get repeated questions over time, and then we'd be asking the team, "Hey, so and so had asked us this. Did you write it down somewhere?" So we just decided to have a central repository where all the information would be. But then we realized that this actually can be quite useful when folks are kind of triaging what to spend their time on, and then when they're ultimately writing their investment memos, and they want to just have a sort of crisp description of the risks, that they can just kind of take some of the material from there directly. So I found this to be from the feedback we've gotten, a useful little thing that you can do in the process to make the diligence on the other side a little bit more smooth.
Yeah. Good tool, good tip. And you'll notice, listener, dear listener, that there's a lot of conversation happening here that references folks and teams, because, this interaction and this transaction doesn't happen. It's not like Bernat says, "Hey, Parag, can you pitch X million in?" And Parag says, "Sure." And it happens, right? Between the two of them, there's teams and stakeholders. So in this case with K2HV and Vedanta, who's involved? Who's involved in the agreement making, and give us a little bit of color on, I guess, the roles of the people involved in that decision making, and maybe even some challenges or obstacles that are faced. I throw that out there, and Parag's nodding, so you can take that one first.
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, from our end, it's a multi-step process, but back up a little bit and saying that K2 is a private investment company. We are an $800 million evergreen structure, so we can recycle our capital. We're not going out multiple times to raise capital every few years. And I say that as a way of background because it aids in sort of what our decision-making process is, in that it's myself and my co-founder, Anup, I mentioned. We are the investment committee. We don't have to go outside of that structure to ultimately make a decision to make an investment. And so in this particular case, though, we don't make those decisions facetiously, and we do all the diligence up front, and we put together a deal team, typically of 4 people. In this case, I was leading it, but Austin really was leading. And I get to say I'm leading it, but Austin was the true lead in terms of digging in. And then he has a couple other people from our team, in this case, Jason and Patrick, who all together really dug in on the materials. And they come back and we talk about it internally, and we make an initial decision whether or not we can issue a term sheet. Before that, Bernat and I are talking to understand parameters around what makes sense, right? So that we know is there a fit here? Is there a fit for what they want, what we want to do, how much we want to do, timelines? Will the timelines work out? What else is going on in anyone's pipeline at any given time to be able to put the resources to get things done? So all those things come into consideration. And then where does this stack up in terms of your level of interest with respect to the rest of the things you're working on? Mm-hmm. So if this all bubbles up to the top of the stack or somewhere in the top 5 in the stack, say, let's go and do this, because there's an opportunity cost, right? Just by us doing the work and we get excited doesn't mean Bernat has to pick us.
Right.
There's still everybody, on the investment side, you still have to market yourself as well, right? You still have to bring things to the table, and ultimately the company gets to decide who they're going to allow in or bring into the fold if they're, if the supply and demand plays out that way. And, in many cases it does in good companies. So yeah, I mean, Bernat and I were talking at the top level, but there are many other people involved. We're making sure the parameters make sense. And then we go up and down from there to make sure everybody's in agreement with those decisions. And hopefully we come together on a signed term sheet, which we did, which then moves to, going forward. And I'm talking about the signed term sheet on the debt side. And then we're also looking at the terms led by the syndicate on the equity financing of $106.5 million by Magnetar and others who are involved. And do we want to participate in those terms as well?
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, and from our end, the board of directors weighs in on the terms, and if the board of directors is supportive, then our team kind of does the work. So we organize ourselves as a team of 3 that does most of the work during the financing. So it's our chief financial officer, Mark, our head of strategy and BD, Pranita, and myself, that will be part of all the tactical aspects of the process of bringing it to conclusion, which are both sort of on the legal side, all the documents, but then also on the diligence side, making sure that the investors have access to the information that they need. And then these 3 from the team kind of branch into the rest of the team to get what we need as the requests come in. So typically, the diligence requests fall into very predictable buckets that will be corporate. So Pranita takes care of a lot of that. Clinical, usually will go to Jeff's team or CMO, and he'll provide that information. CMC, so we'll go to Dan's team, he'll provide that information. So basically, there's this small team that kind of reaches out to the rest of the company, gets the information that you need, puts it into the hands of the investors, and then when the diligences are finished, then switches to focus on just the mechanics of closing the deal.
When it comes to turning your innovations into clinical realities, the first step is transforming your process. On the Business of Biotech podcast, we bring emerging biotechs weekly insights to advance their pipelines, from funding to regulatory and other need-to-know topics. The pod is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva, a global provider of technologies and services that advance and accelerate the development, manufacture, and delivery of therapeutics. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. The term sheet that you mentioned, Parag, is this sort of sort of where the gives and gets of the relationship, if you will, reside? Like the stated, I don't know, gives and gets is probably a pretty bad way to characterize it, but is that kind of where that element of the relationship is codified?
Yeah, definitely. It's the start. It's a very important point to make sure you're working on the same basis and you have the key fundamental points agreed upon in terms of how we're moving forward and providing our capital. And this is on the debt capital side, the less dilutive capital that helps the company, extend out runway in different scenarios. It also forms the basis for potentially, the terms under which, over time you might provide more capital, right? So you want to make sure everybody understands the pieces there. And I mean, Bernat and team are familiar with that type of capital. They understood it. We got to explain a little more about our unique take on it, if you may, and how we might play over time with the company on a go forward basis. So it forms the basis of that for sure.
Yeah. Is there I'm just curious. I mean, I've never been privy to a negotiation like this. Is there a degree of negotiation? Is there a degree of I don't know? Is finagling is probably a bad way to put it, but is there sort of some negotiation that takes place? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, and the negotiation happens on a few different arenas. Obviously, there's the financial terms, right? That is a big focus of it because that affects multiple parties, multiple stakeholders are involved in that, right? That is the company, the management team, the existing shareholders, which wear a slightly different hat than new shareholders coming in, and then the board who's supposed to manage all the different dynamics and make the best decision they can for the company. So there's the financial terms, and then there's the business terms, which affect how you get your capital in the first place. What are some of the milestones in the future that might be important, things like that.
Yeah, I might have said finagling, but I think I meant haggling. I think haggling is the word I was aiming for. Bernat, you talked a little bit about what some of this funding is earmarked for, and I'm curious about that in the context of the question I just asked. Does that play into the agreement, the terms of the deal? Like, if you were to say to Parag, I intend to spend some of this money on X, and Parag was like, that's not really the part of your project that we want to fund. Does that kind of play into it, or is it more directed by you?
I'm sure it can, but it hasn't. And I think it shouldn't. I think the management team should decide what they think is the best use of proceeds. You understand best your feeling your company. The conviction should originate from you for why that's the right use of the dollars. Yeah. And then the investors can decide if this is a plan that they like, or if this is a plan that they're going to take a pass on because they view it differently and maybe they don't think that's the right use of proceeds. Obviously, once an investor is part of the board, then you have a say on that, and year after year, you'll decide if the way the budget is set up and how the money is spent is right. But at the time of the financing, there has to be very good clarity on high-level terms, how you're going to use the funds and what type of data you're trying to get with that. That has to be crystal clear. And not surprisingly, in this financing, we spent a fair amount of time explaining exactly what money goes where, and what type of data we expect to get when with that funding. And I think that's really a critical, one of the most important exercises in the financing, making sure that everybody's aligned around how the funds are being used.
Yeah. And Matt, we look at the financial model in excruciating detail, and we'll give feedback on that and thoughts as, okay, what happens under different circumstances. But we know once we provide the capital, it's up to the management team how they're going to use it, spend it. We just exactly as Bernat said, it's their call at the end of the day as to what that capital, other than Bernat buying a plane to get back to Catalonia quicker during the season. Everything else is probably on the table.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it dovetails nicely with the next question I had for you guys, and it's a question that I hate to ask because it just invites softball, fluffy, feel good responses. But it's about cultural match, and a lot of that has to do with trust, right? Like you're what you just said, Parag, is that like, yeah, we're gonna agree to the deal, and we're gonna hand it over, and we trust that it's going to be put to good use, and that's a cultural thing. Like that's ensured in the cultural match. So give us a little bit of that, I guess, flavor around. Again, I hate to ask a question because it's one that you don't really It doesn't invite a quantifiable response, but how do you assess and suss out the cultural fit between the two companies? Parag, I'll invite you to start with that one.
Sure. I mean, I mentioned it a little bit before, and I mean, I think we really do try and live and breathe this, and the idea of profit and purpose together, and looking for that in things that we get involved with. Had the good fortune, I had the good fortune with my co-founder to start this K2 Health Ventures from scratch, and I left another firm back in 2015, partially because of just dynamics around senior management team, et cetera. And the idea here was really, if I, to be honest, I didn't want to go, I didn't know if I'd come back into the investment world, because maybe the DNA or the personality type that tends to get into the investment mindset is not always the type of people I want to hang out with. And so at some point in time, you decide, well, what is it that you really want to do with your life? Or I was fortunate enough that I didn't have to come back into this, right? That's the one side of the finance world. You make more money than you probably should in the process of the type of things you get to do. And if you're good enough, you can do pretty well. And so you could take your time and figure out what you really want to do. And when I did decide to come back into this, it was about doing with people I really, really wanted to do it with, and trying to align on our vision. And so that idea of, okay, we have a thesis, we want to go, we're looking for very interesting platform companies. We're looking for companies that truly have something differentiating IP or a differentiating process, or they've figured out some hard problems, or the people have been at it for a while and they've gotten somewhere. They have good backers. You look for, as Bernat said, you look for various signals in that. And then you're looking for an alignment in, as you said, the cultural match. Like, are these people you want to work with? Is this somebody you'd want to work with, right? You do have a choice in that matter. It's not only about the profit, right? And so is what they're doing meaningful to you? Are you going to be excited about talking about it and moving forward? And you don't always make all your investment decisions based on that, but if you can, at least for the majority of the time, do that, it's a nice ability. And I'll mention that when we get to our portfolio, which I'll use the word, it's diverse for a reason, but it's based on real expertise that we have in-house that then focuses on specific areas. Yeah.
How would you respond to that question, Dr. Olle? The question around sussing out this cultural match and moving forward on more than feel good intuition.
Yeah. So first, re-acknowledging that there's many factors that go into the decision that are not cultural. Obviously, how much money can a group put in, their reputation. There's more like mechanical aspects of the investment that are very important nonetheless. But culturally, I would emphasize the things that I mentioned before again. Just like in teammates that we'll work on, we look for, do they really understand what they're getting into? Do they understand the company well? Does it seem like they really care about this field based on what they choose to ask? And then more importantly, can they be very straightforward and candid and tell you exactly what they think? Give you either positive feedback or constructive, challenging feedback when needed. Again, this is one of the hardest things to get from people, whether they're a teammate or an investor. And I would argue for an investor is even harder to get from a teammate, because some of the incentives that lead people that work together every day to be candid with each other are not present when you interact less often in an investor entrepreneur dynamic. So being able to find a few folks to work with that can be really candid and tell you exactly what they think about the company without regard to whether this will put them in a better or worse position, but just because they think it's the right thing to do. That is a rare thing to find, and I value that. Yeah,
very good. How are you guys doing on time? I just looked at the clock and thought, boy, I've got a lot more to cover. You have time for a few more? You good? Yeah. Okay. Yep. I don't want to abuse your time. I want to touch on just a couple more things, and one of those is the majority of our audience are the leaders of, as I said, new and emerging biopharma companies. Many of them aspirational, many of them seeing this stuff for the first time. So I'm hoping you can share some advice and insight based on your experiences around best practices for those hitting the fundraising trail, perhaps for the first time. So, Bernat, talk about getting attention. Like, this is getting attention. Man, I've interviewed so many folks in this space, and most of them very, very good at it. Understanding the sort of the foundational, the important foundational aspects of getting attention, but a few who maybe aren't so good at it. Like, they're striving for attention that they don't necessarily deserve.
Yeah, attention is part of it, but I would say not the most important. I mean, there's different channels, of course. Even if you're a private company, you should make use of press releases to explain to the rest of the world what you think is most important that the company has established. And there is value to the media covering those to some degree. Mm-hmm. There is also such a thing as like too much exposure beyond, whatever your news are, or the newsworthiness or of what you have to share is. But the actual fundraising process is a mix of you proactively reaching to groups that you think are going to be the right fit, and some groups reaching to you because they learned about you through some of the channels through which you saw that attention. I think when you get into the process of actually getting not the attention but the money, then each situation is different, right? What field you are in, how supportive is your existing syndicate of insiders? Do you have clinical data? Or how far are you from getting clinical data?
Yeah.
Will the current financing get you all the way to whatever is the next milestone? How much money do you need to get to the next month? All of those things make each fundraising different for each person. So it's difficult to sort of give generic advice. But I think that there are some common elements in the current environment, which we talked about before. On the entrepreneur side, we all have to do more work to raise the same amount of money as a few years ago. More meetings, longer diligence processes. You have to be a little bit more patient with that. It's just normal in this environment. Investors will take more time and be more demanding about terms. I think generally, talking biotech, looking through the financing process with some of the following things in mind is useful. One, whatever was the pool of investors that you reached in your previous financing, consider broadening it. Consider broadening it geographically and by type of investor.
Yeah.
Number two, because that will generate more work than you had before, then be more deliberate about finding out who is active from that pool of investors. It's not easy information to get. It's not like you can Google who are the active investors or ChatGPT it, but there are ways to find out who is being active. Again, you can talk to bankers, AR firms, talk to your board, and focus the efforts in groups that you know are investing. And then in this environment, really, really focus on the substance. If you have clinical data, if you have a commercial path, that really is what investors want to hear more about now. And so make sure you give the right amount of time to the substance. There have been other times in our field where, telling a really exciting story about what could happen in the future may be an advisable thing to do in a financing process. And you should all have your own thesis for where you want to take the company. But you should also understand that in this environment today, what many investors will really want to hear is, okay, how efficient can you be with the money that I'm giving you? What data are you going to get? How quickly? And how the risk is the process? And make sure that there's a drug behind what they're investing, not just an idea or a hypothesis or a platform.
Yeah. Yeah. Parag, you and I have, here's something you and I have in common. Everybody wants our attention, right? Like everybody wants our attention for different reasons. Everyone wants my attention because I'm a spreader of that attention, right? I'm a spreader of the message, just by virtue of what I do. And they want your attention because you're a giver of the lifeblood of what they do. I have my own, my own cues to look for, my own methods for sussing out who I want to give my attention to and who I don't. What are yours? Like, what are you looking for, and what are you dismissing out of hand?
Yeah, and I think human psychology plays a big role in this piece of it, and in terms of what gets one's attention in general. And I think I was thinking about your question, before this, and the biggest piece I find is that coming through a trusted source, right? If you need to get through all the noise, right? You get blasts, emails, cold emails, somebody on LinkedIn, something here, something there. But the ones that typically rise to the top that you spend a little bit of time on at least is coming through a trusted source. And I think that plays itself out across multiple factors. If you're interviewing for a job, right, what rises to the top of a resume is if somebody calls the partner at that firm and says, hey, I know this person, I've worked with them before, you should at least take a look. So out of the 50 in your pile, you're at least going to look at that resume. Yeah. Very similar for us, like whether it comes through a board member we know, comes through another entrepreneur. We get a lot of referrals from CEOs and CFOs of our portfolio companies. It's, hey, I know this CEO and they're doing XYZ. I think it's pretty interesting. Take a look. You'll at least take a look, right? You'll do that courtesy to take a look. If not, at least to give some advice if you can. And best case, you start to get further interested in it. So I think the shortest answer for me is that just coming through. And the entrepreneur has to do some work for that, right? They have to do the work. Maybe that's when I first started in this business, it was hitting every conference possible. Yeah. So that I get to know people. And there's no substitute from the legwork. You have to do it, no matter how good you think you might be, how great your science might be, how much money you might have, you still have to do the legwork and put yourself out there and make the relationships and show up at events and talk to people so that ultimately you do your first and your second, your third thing, and people get to know you as to who you are, and then they're willing to refer you. So I think that basis helps us filter out things initially, as the primary factor. And the other part is show up at conferences because we're there too, right? Yeah. And we happen to meet and we might get into a good conversation, and one thing leads to the others.
Yeah, it's the conferences thing is interesting. For a good long while there, 18, 24 months, whatever it was, that block of time, that the black hole that was COVID, that kept everyone grounded. I had a lot of conversations with biopharma startups, leaders of biopharma startups who were pitching over Zoom, right? Like that, it was the only thing they had. And pitch deck, we spent a lot of time talking about pitch decks and just how important they were because you had to present something over Zoom. Are pitch decks like still, is that still a place to focus a lot of your time and effort, Bernat, and energy?
It is a place worth spending time and effort. I think it's a good use of the CEO's time to make sure that the story comes across very clearly on that short document that you're going to rely on with the very limited time that you have with investors. So yes, we still very much use this, and it's expected, and it's expected because it's actually a useful tool, right? I'm no particular fan of PowerPoint or any specific tool, but yeah, I think that using graphic support and slide support to inform some of the key messages that you want your investors to understand can be very helpful. To convey the substance behind the company will be very helpful too. And providing those as reading documents before, after the meeting, so that if the people want to do some preparation before the meeting, they can, and they can do it with one single document where you try to concentrate everything that you think is important. Or if they want to follow up after the meeting, they can refer to what was discussed. So yeah, I'm a supporter of the use of the pitch deck.
Yeah. Parag's like, it better be a good one though, because I see a lot of them.
Yeah, I think if you can, as Bernat said, and it's a good exercise because it allows, I think, anybody to hone in on what are the most important messages they want to put out there, as well as if you can anticipate the key questions that somebody's going to ask you and it's answered for you in 15 slides, that's very valuable to somebody. It piques their interest further that, oh, wow, they're really thinking about this in an interesting way, or they've thought about this issue deep enough that I'm curious now to understand.
Yeah, and it's also good. It's also a good experimentation tool early on in the financing process. So whenever you kick off a process, you're going to be in a different place than you were the last time that you fundraised. So you're going to have to brush up the deck, and hopefully it will look different from whatever it was the last time, right? Mm-hmm. But you don't know from the get-go which are the themes that will really resonate for investors. You just know what you think is important, and you'll spend the time accordingly. And then as you start experimenting with the deck and having discussions with investors, you'll see that there are slides that, although you thought were important, they never really get any question at all from anybody, because either they're obvious or turns out that you thought it was important, but other people don't agree. You can get some very useful feedback. Or you may have questions that come up where you keep referring to a slide in the appendix, and then after a while you're like, well, maybe that should be in the main deck, because that it's important. That's what people want to know, right? So early in the financing process, the deck can be a tool to help you figure out, okay, which are the messages that I wanted to convey that are landing well, and where am I coming up short? And then you can use that information to tinker a little bit with the deck, and hopefully when you get deeper into the financing process and you're using it many times with many investors, you quickly hone it into a version that works.
Yeah. Parag, I want to get your quick take on the where, because you mentioned it, the conferences thing. Like, the obvious one that comes to mind is JP Morgan, right? You got to be at JP Morgan. I don't, maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'm interested in your perspective on that. But like, if you're considering conferences and events where, you sort of expect players to be there and ready to play, what of those conferences and events would you sort of reference?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot nowadays that's evolved over the years, but a lot of the investment banking conferences, have done a good job with the technology and platforms to provide these one-on-one meetings, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, you can show up and go to a company presentation, but you can also have a slate of meetings, and, online you're matching up, hey, I'm interested in talking to these 10 companies. And many people on our team 3-4 people from our team might go to any particular name an investment bank conference that's happening, whether it's New York, Boston, San Francisco. Some they'll go in person and some they'll do virtually. And you'll have these one-on-one meetings set up. And it's an ability to kind of speed date, if you may, right? Mm-hmm. With a number of different companies, talk to people in a few different fields in an area that you've gotten particular interested in, and you're talking to companies there. Some may be raising money then, some may be raising money a year from now, but you start to develop the relationship.
Yeah. Oh, very good. Very good. Parag, I want to get to that portfolio diversity question I had for you. I want to give you an opportunity to explain the rationale there. Sure. And then we'll get into some final thoughts and wrap things up here. Cause like I said, I feel like I'm abusing your time.
No, yeah. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate the conversation. And I mean, as I mentioned, K2 focuses broadly on life sciences and healthcare. Within life sciences, and particularly within biotech, R&D stage biotech, within that, we're looking at, you'll see all of our biotech companies typically are platform companies. They have the ability to have multiple legs of the stool with intellectual property, have the ability to spawn multiple programs. And then you layer on top of that, what are the expertise of the people that we have, internally, and where can they go deep, and where do they want to go deep, where they have looked at before. We have, an individual on our team who's gone pretty deep, Derek, on the oncology space. We have, so in the biotech arena, we will focus across a bunch of different areas, some of what we know and some of which we're willing to dig in to deeply. You ag biotech, you mentioned, for example.
Yeah, I did. That was one of the things I was like, what? They got med device, software, ag biotech, in addition to ATMPs and interesting things like microbiome.
Yeah, so it is ag biotech, but fundamentally it's a gene editing company that focuses on the seed genome rather than the human genome. And as we got deeper into understanding, we got, reference into that company by an investor we know, and Flagship, who had started the company, and the team was very, very impressive. So as we got deeper and deeper and really did our work, we got to understand the applications of biotech tools to a new ecosystem and where the frontier was there. And that company, has recently raised a couple $100 million round to continue to finance itself.
And dare I say, Parag, and I'm not going to invite this question right now because Bernat, I feel like could probably go on for about 45 minutes or more. I don't think ag biotech is necessarily too many clicks removed from the microbiome. At the end of the day, we talk about One Health, right? We talk about population health and One Health. We could have a pretty intellectual discussion about ag biotech and its relationship to the human microbiome.
Yeah, and I mean in the medical. Sorry,
Bernat, he's either shaking me off like no.
I was saying yes. It's a bacterial world we're just living in.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say to your question, I mean, medical devices. We have a individual on our team who used to be a partner at domain in medical devices, and so we bring different pieces to bear. But broadly speaking, though, I would talk about why do people use our capital? It's the use cases. Does the use case make sense? Meaning, the typical question we'll ask is, hey, if you had management team, CEO, CSO, CFO, if you had an extra $20 or $30 million today in less dilutive capital, could you do something with it that would create more value inflection points for you in the same amount of time? Meaning, could you take program 2 or 3 through the clinic a little quicker? Could you better power your clinical trials? Would it help you in a negotiation with a strategic by having a better balance sheet ahead of that negotiation? Or would it just give you a little bit more comfort that if timelines slip, I'm not going to run out of capital before I have to raise my next round? So that's where we play, is in those use cases for biotech and other companies, other life sciences companies in this space. And then, we do have this other side to us that is in the healthcare space, because as mentioned before, one of our partners, Austin, was in the value-based care space and understands the payer provider dynamic pretty well. So he's led some of our investments into that world as well. So we're basing it on our diligence, but then fundamentally these use cases that allow people to extend their runways in a less dilutive way. If I need $400 million to get to the end game, if 50 million of that is with less dilutive capital, well, maybe I should make that a part of my overall strategy to get it over time, to help fund it so I can do it in an overall less dilutive way for myself and my shareholders.
Well, use case is that's a great answer, and it's a great segue to my final question for Bernat, and that's what's next for Bernat. I know you're heading into phase 3. This capital is going to be used to power through that trial, but give us a little more insight into that and what the steps look like to get you there.
Yeah, so our field has been through some ups and downs, as you noted at the beginning of the conversation today. Mm-hmm. Recently, it's seen the first 2 approvals of microbiome-based drugs, one in December, one in April. These are drugs for the same infectious disease that we're targeting. And so this is a first important step in the field. Now FDA has said this is good enough for an approval. And I think what's next for us, but also for the field, is show that we can do better than. Well, in both cases, those drugs are made of fecal donations, which carries a number of issues in terms of safety, in terms of quality attributes of the product changing from fecal donation to fecal donation, but also in terms of commercial scalability. And so what we want to bring to the field is a defined modality where we can break free from the need to use fecal donors and have drugs that are not made from feces. I think we can do better as a field, and we should be able to get there.
Yeah.
And so if we can get a first drug approved and show that is in fact possible, that is the key first priority. So get a first defined consortium drug approved. In this case, we're looking at the recurrent C. difficile population. But then the other thing that we want to do with the financing is do a well-done, well-powered randomized experiment to see if the utility of this type of drugs can be expanded beyond infectious disease, which is something that many investors are eager to see, but many patients are even eager to see. And specifically, we're looking at the inflammatory bowel disease field. This is a field where there's been several decades of research looking at the role of the microbiome driving disease. And there we're starting a randomized phase 2 study globally in patients that have mild to moderate ulcerative colitis. And what we'd like to see is, so the experimental question is, if you compare it to placebo in patients that have received some of the earlier, safer drugs that are given to colitis patients, but not yet the more hardcore biologics that have safety issues associated with them, in this patient population, can you see a meaningful efficacy with a clean safety profile? This is the second question that we're trying to ask in this timeframe and with these funds. And so that's what's next for us.
Yeah. Well, all good work, and we'll be paying attention. Next time we have you on, there'll be a part 3, I promise, and we'll be talking about phase 3 results.
Maybe approved drugs.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it might be part 4 or a combo. Parag, how about K2 Health Ventures? What's next for you? Any exciting new additional portfolio expansions?
We're always, as you opened this conversation with, if you landed from Mars and you looked what was happening right now in the biotech universe, it's a pretty unique time, a difficult time for many, from a point of view of the fact that we've had 10 years of a real bull market with a lot of money pumped into this arena, with a lot of good science being developed, but people getting maybe a little sloppy with the amount of burn each company is hitting on a monthly basis. And it's coming home a little bit to roost with it being unsustainable for that many companies burning $5 to $10 million per month each. So some of that aftermath is playing itself out now. Even companies that have pretty good science, for the first time maybe in biotech's history, may not get funded. So it's an interesting time to be watching that. At the same time, we continue to participate, because the companies that have, again, great platforms and great management teams and still good backers will get funded. We had one of our, a little shout out to one of our portfolio companies that just announced today a $140 million raise. This is a small cap biotech company with a $50 million market cap that closed a $150 million public offering. So, no straight up. But why? Because it's T-Scan Therapeutics, great platform in cell therapy, great management team, and backers that could go along with them. Baker Brothers and others and ourselves participated in that. And so it's a type of thing where there is still plenty of capital to be put out there. And, we have plenty of capital to put out there, but it's looking at the things we talked about today. Management teams that are focused can, figure out the priorities. Maybe you can't spend as much as you wanted to, as you could have 2 years ago, because capital is not as cheap. Maybe you have to prioritize a little differently, and you learn lessons from that. But you can still ultimately get there. Just as Bernat mentioned, it takes a little bit more patience these days on each front. But still, biotech, there's so much to do, and there will always be money for things that have not been cured yet. And that's one thing about this industry that I don't have any doubt about, that there will continue to be good people and capital and people invested into it. So we're looking forward to keep going.
Yeah. Were there good use cases? I like that part of the conversation from you. And T-Scan Therapeutics is the name of the company. T-Scan Therapeutics. All right, good. That's another one. I'll put them on blast. We'll get their CFO or their CEO on the podcast as well. Guys, I really enjoyed the conversation. I feel like we could spend a whole lot more time talking, but we're going to wrap things up here. And but I really appreciate the transparency and the thought behind your responses. I think it's super valuable for our audience, and I think this was really time well spent. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt, very much. Thank you.
So that's Vedanta Biosciences, Dr. Bernat Olle, and K2 Health Ventures, Parag Shah. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online with support from Cytiva, which demonstrates its commitment to new and emerging biotech companies at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. If you're enjoying the show, sign up for our newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. Also, be sure to leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. And as always, thanks for listening.